The opening frame of this confrontation is not a gesture of reconciliation, but a reminder that even détente, when wielded as a threat, functions as pressure rather than relief. When Donald Trump positioned himself publicly against Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine, the language was stripped of ambiguity, an ultimatum masked as diplomacy. Each escalation carried the risk of triggering a disproportionate response. Russia's repeated nuclear rhetoric, while not acted upon, underscored the fragility of deterrence. Trump's intervention added a new layer, an implicit challenge that if Putin pressed further, the possibility of a political off-ramp would vanish and military pressure would escalate under American orchestration. Thus, détente became a conditional trap: comply or face intensified war. The economic ripples spread far beyond Ukraine's borders. Energy markets, already recalibrated after 2 winters of instability, remained hypersensitive to supply disruptions. Agricultural exports from the Black Sea corridor, intermittently halted by Russian strikes, threatened food security across the global south, especially in Africa and the Middle East. Defense industries in the US and Europe accelerated production, reshaping industrial priorities and fueling a new cycle of military Keynesianism. At the same time, financial markets interpreted Trump's rhetoric not as a guarantee of stability, but as another variable of uncertainty. Investors recalculated risk across European equities, currency exchange rates, and commodity futures, recognizing that diplomacy framed as threat deepened unpredictability. The political and diplomatic pressures mounted as allies scrambled to interpret Trump's intentions. European leaders, wary of both Putin's resolve and Washington's volatility, accelerated contingency planning for a scenario in which U.S. leadership fractured NATO consensus. Russia, in turn, exploited the ambiguity, using state media to portray Trump's statement as evidence of Western weakness, that even within America, leadership oscillated between coercion and disengagement. China observed carefully, calculating how U.S. threats to Russia over Ukraine might foreshadow future coercive détente aimed at Beijing in the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, states of the global south saw opportunity, positioning themselves as neutral brokers, but also as beneficiaries of discounted Russian energy and grain. The conclusion remains open-ended, not because resolution is absent, but because the dynamics are locked in perpetual escalation. Trump's threat of détente does not end the war. It weaponizes diplomacy as another front. Putin, facing sanctions, battlefield attrition, and domestic strain, cannot easily concede without undermining Russia's strategic posture. Ukraine, dependent on external support, cannot survive without a unified Western front. And NATO, pulled between deterrence and exhaustion, remains vulnerable to fractures induced by political cycles in Washington. The chain of crises thus intensifies. Military attrition bleeds into economic uncertainty, political signaling destabilizes alliances, and diplomacy itself becomes indistinguishable from pressure. The détente threat, therefore, is not a path to peace, but another mechanism of systemic fragility, ensuring that the conflict in Ukraine continues to function as the central arena in which global power struggles collide. The hook lies in the paradox that what should have been an easing of tensions carried within it the sharpened edges of coercion, signaling that the relationship between Washington and Moscow had not moved toward stability but toward a new conditional fragility. Trump's statement reverberated through global capitals, not because it was unexpected, but because it crystallized a fundamental truth. Ukraine remains the fuse, and Russia remains the pivot in a conflict that defines the structural fault lines of the international order. The event description sharpens around the setting of late summer, when battlefield dynamics appeared at once static and volatile. Ukrainian forces, struggling to maintain momentum after months of attritional warfare, continued to rely heavily on Western military support, intelligence coordination, and advanced weaponry. Russia, having entrenched its positions across the eastern and southern fronts, redirected its strategic signaling toward hybrid escalation, intensifying drone and missile strikes, testing NATO's response thresholds, and simultaneously deepening ties with non-Western states such as Iran, North Korea, and China. It was against this backdrop that Trump, anticipating a return to the White House, leveraged his persona as a dealmaker to frame détente not as dialogue but as leverage, signaling to Putin that continued aggression would foreclose any possibility of negotiated relief. The message was less about halting bloodshed and more about conditioning Russia's political survival on compliance with American-defined terms. This exposed the systemic vulnerabilities within the broader transatlantic security framework. NATO's cohesion, while outwardly solid, faced fractures beneath the surface. Eastern flank states demanded more permanent deployments, while Western European capitals wrestled with the cost of prolonged support. Energy diversification had reduced immediate dependency on Russian hydrocarbons, but vulnerabilities in LNG infrastructure, electricity grids, and industrial supply chains persisted. Meanwhile, the American political system itself represented a vulnerability. Trump's signaling underscored the volatility of U.S. commitments, reminding allies and adversaries alike that the durability of Western policy is hostage to electoral cycles and domestic polarization. Russia exploited this vulnerability, timing escalations to test not only Ukraine's endurance, but also the coherence of NATO's resolve under shifting U.S. leadership signals. Military escalation loomed as a constant, not through dramatic offensives, but through grinding attrition. Russia expanded drone warfare with Iranian technology, integrating swarms into deep strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukraine, countering with Western-supplied long-range systems, pushed the war into Crimea and across the border into Belgorod, signaling that Russian territory was no longer immune from strike. The second layer of this unfolding documentary deepens around the recognition that Trump's warning to Putin was not an isolated soundbite, but a catalytic force, amplifying multiple pressure points across the global system. The hook here lies in the dangerous ambiguity of signaling. A former American president, positioned as a potential future commander-in-chief, projected threats of détente that were not grounded in institutional consensus but in personal leverage. This created a paradoxical feedback loop. Russia, seeking to demonstrate resolve, risked intensifying the very conditions that invited greater Western military involvement, while Ukraine, fearing abandonment, pushed harder for systems that deepened escalation thresholds. The economic ripple effects multiplied across multiple theaters. Europe continued to shoulder high costs of energy diversification, investing heavily in LNG infrastructure and renewable projects while facing industrial competitiveness challenges. Inflationary pressures tied to war-driven supply disruptions eroded political stability, fueling populist movements skeptical of prolonged support for Ukraine. In the global south, food insecurity deepened as the Black Sea Grain Initiative collapsed under Russian pressure, triggering shortages in import-dependent states. Defense spending surged globally, with military-industrial complexes in the US, Europe, and Asia accelerating production cycles, embedding a new structural dependency on militarized economies. Trump's intervention reinforced this economic volatility, signaling that diplomacy itself had become a variable in markets, with futures pricing in the instability of US. Signaling as much as battlefield outcomes. Politically and diplomatically, the reverberations extended into fragile balances of influence. European leaders, particularly in Berlin and Paris, scrambled to interpret whether Trump's warning indicated a genuine shift or a temporary positioning maneuver. Eastern Europe, historically skeptical of Russian intent, viewed the statement as insufficient, pressing for stronger guarantees that any détente would not translate into frozen conflict. Moscow, meanwhile, sought to weaponize ambiguity, amplifying narratives that American politics were fractured and unreliable, portraying Trump's stance as evidence that Washington was divided and thus less formidable. Beijing observed with strategic calculation, understanding that the conditioning of détente on compliance in Ukraine could prefigure similar frameworks in Taiwan or the South China Sea, where the U.S. might use diplomatic carrots laced with coercive sticks. For the global South, the episode reaffirmed cynicism toward Western diplomacy, reinforcing perceptions that peace proposals are less about mediation than about alignment with great power interests. The conclusion of this second sequence remains unresolved, defined not by resolution, but by intensification. The détente threat projected by Trump did not diffuse conflict, but reframed it: diplomacy as ultimatum, negotiation as conditional surrender. Putin, facing the dual imperatives of preserving strategic depth and sustaining domestic legitimacy, could not afford to appear coerced, while Ukraine, bound by survival imperatives, could not accept any framework that implied concession. NATO, tethered to Washington's political cycles, faced systemic fragility in its core assumptions of permanence. Thus, the chain of escalation persisted, battlefield attrition fed into alliance vulnerability, economic turbulence reinforced political instability, and diplomatic signaling blurred the line between peace initiatives and threats. Trump's words, delivered as a gesture of leverage, became another inflection point in a conflict where every signal compounds uncertainty and every uncertainty amplifies the pressure cooker of global order. This ambiguity destabilized not only adversaries but also allies, revealing that the war in Ukraine is not merely a battlefield confrontation, but a prism refracting every fracture line of the international order. What emerged was the uncomfortable reality that U.S. foreign policy could no longer be read as continuity, but as oscillation, and that oscillation itself became a weapon, unpredictability wielded as strategy. The event description moves to the battlefield realities that formed the backdrop. Ukraine's counteroffensive, once heralded as a decisive moment, had slowed into attritional warfare marked by staggering human and material costs. Russian fortifications, layered with trenches, mines, and electronic warfare, turned every kilometer into a lethal contest. The skies above Ukraine became saturated with drones, surveillance assets, and missile exchanges, creating a permanent theater of hybrid combat where the line between conventional and unconventional warfare blurred. Russia's strikes on Ukraine's energy grid and port infrastructure carried not just tactical intent, but strategic messaging to demonstrate resilience, impose long-term costs, and weaponize winter. In parallel, Ukrainian strikes on Crimea and cross-border Russian regions carried symbolic weight, proving that Moscow itself could not fully shield its population from the consequences of aggression. Into this volatile theater entered Trump's intervention, framed not by military detail but by political leverage, threatening Putin with the evaporation of future bargaining options unless Russia altered its course. Systemic vulnerability widened as global institutions proved unable to mitigate escalation. The United Nations remained paralyzed, with the Security Council locked in predictable vetoes and the General Assembly reduced to symbolic resolutions. Multilateral frameworks designed for conflict mediation faltered against the scale of entrenched geopolitical rivalry. NATO, while strengthened in expansion with Finland and Sweden's accession, remained structurally constrained by divergent national priorities. Eastern members demanded escalated deterrence, while Southern European states focused on migration pressures and economic strain. This divergence threatened cohesion, particularly as Trump's rhetoric highlighted the conditionality of American commitments. In effect, the alliance's greatest strength, collective defense, was shadowed by its greatest weakness, dependence on U.S. credibility, itself hostage to political oscillations in Washington. Military escalation, while grinding, showed no signs of plateau. Russia integrated North Korean munitions into its supply chains, tightening its war economy in defiance of sanctions. Ukraine increasingly pressed for access to advanced Western systems such as F-16s and ATACMS, framing them not as luxuries, but as survival necessities. Each weapon transfer sparked new Russian warnings of escalation, reviving the specter of nuclear posturing. Trump's threat of détente compounded this tension, for it signaled to Moscow that compliance might stave off escalation, but non-compliance could accelerate Western rearmament under U.S. orchestration. The third movement of this unfolding crisis intensifies around the recognition that Trump's words were less an isolated intervention than a reconfiguration of the geopolitical chessboard. The hook is clear. Détente, traditionally a mechanism of easing Cold War tensions, was invoked here as an instrument of pressure, reshaping the psychological and strategic calculus of both adversaries and allies. Financial markets interpreted Trump's rhetoric as a destabilizing signal, increasing volatility in European equities, energy futures, and currency exchanges. Defense industries across the transatlantic alliance accelerated production schedules, embedding a structural militarization of economies that reoriented resources away from civilian priorities. These economic reverberations underlined the interdependence of war and global stability, making clear that no region remained insulated from the pressures emanating out of Ukraine. Political and diplomatic pressures multiplied as capitals recalibrated their strategies in response to Trump's intervention. European leaders, already grappling with electoral volatility at home, sought to hedge against the possibility of a fractured American commitment. Germany moved to institutionalize long-term military support for Kiev through budgetary frameworks, while France pressed for European strategic autonomy, fearing overdependence on Washington's oscillations. Russia, seizing on the ambiguity, framed Trump's threat as proof that U.S. policy was incoherent, seeking to exploit divisions within the Western alliance. China monitored closely, understanding that the conditioning of détente in Ukraine might presage similar tactics against Beijing in the Pacific. For states in the global South, the episode reinforced skepticism toward Western diplomacy, framing peace initiatives as instruments of coercion rather than neutral mediation, and increasing receptivity to alternative frameworks promoted by China, Brazil, and India. The conclusion of this third sequence underscores the open-ended escalation that defines the conflict. Trump's words did not offer an off-ramp, but removed one, transforming détente into a narrowing corridor through which Putin could neither pass without capitulation nor ignore without escalation. Ukraine, locked in a war of survival, could not afford to accept settlements framed as concessions. NATO, strained by internal divergences, remained trapped between deterrence imperatives and domestic exhaustion. The economic system, already reoriented toward militarization and instability, absorbed new layers of risk. Diplomacy itself, blurred into ultimatum, lost its mediating function and became indistinguishable from coercion. The net effect was a deepening of systemic fragility. A conflict where every signal amplified volatility, every threat became a structural condition, and the prospect of resolution receded into the distance. What remained was a global order defined by its inability to separate diplomacy from pressure, stability from oscillation, and strategy from uncertainty. By threatening Putin with the loss of a potential political off-ramp, Trump transformed diplomacy into conditional coercion, thereby signaling that American engagement in Ukraine was not anchored in compromise but in leverage, and that any future settlement would be dictated by Washington's terms rather than through multilateral mediation. The event description situates this development against the grim battlefield dynamics of Ukraine. The conflict had metastasized into a war of attrition where human endurance and industrial capacity became decisive variables. Russia entrenched its positions with fortified defense lines stretching from Donetsk to Zaporizhzhia, employing mines, artillery barrages, and electronic jamming to blunt Ukrainian advances. Ukraine responded with precision strikes deep into Crimea and sabotage operations aimed at disrupting Russian logistics, demonstrating that Moscow's rear was increasingly vulnerable. The battle for the skies, dominated by drones and missile systems, symbolized the hybrid nature of the war, low-cost technologies wielded with high-impact disruption. As this attritional stalemate hardened, Trump's threat introduced a new dimension: the possibility that political outcomes could be imposed through strategic pressure rather than negotiated balance, further destabilizing the already volatile trajectory of the war. Systemic vulnerabilities expanded across the Euro-Atlantic framework. NATO's internal divisions became more pronounced as debates intensified over the sustainability of military and financial assistance to Kyiv. Eastern members, led by Poland and the Baltic states, argued that any weakness in support would embolden Moscow to test Article 5 commitments. Western European capitals, facing rising domestic discontent, weighed the limits of long-term aid against internal political pressures. Within the United States, partisan polarization turned Ukraine into a proxy for domestic political struggle, with Trump's rhetoric amplifying uncertainties about the durability of American commitments. This fragility revealed a broader systemic vulnerability, that the Western alliance, while militarily formidable, remained politically brittle, vulnerable to oscillations not only in battlefield outcomes, but in electoral cycles and populist currents. Military escalation continued its incremental climb. Russia intensified missile barrages targeting Ukrainian power infrastructure, preparing once again to weaponize winter as a season of strategic attrition. Ukraine pressed harder for advanced Western systems, from F-16 fighter jets to long-range strike capabilities, framing them as indispensable to survival rather than escalation. Each delivery widened the escalation ladder, drawing NATO deeper into the conflict's operational logic. Trump's invocation of détente as threat reinforced this cycle by making clear that restraint would be conditioned on Russian compliance, thus signaling that military escalation was not only a tactical possibility, but a political inevitability should Moscow fail to adjust. The paradox was stark. The very notion of détente, designed to prevent spirals, became a mechanism for deepening the spiral itself. Economic ripples cascaded outward with renewed force. Global energy markets, though partially stabilized through diversification, remained hypersensitive to Russian disruptions. Moscow's targeting of Ukrainian ports disrupted grain exports, heightening food insecurity across North Africa and the Middle East. Europe's industrial base continued to suffer under elevated energy costs, reshaping manufacturing competitiveness and triggering debates over deindustrialization. The fourth phase of this unfolding narrative reveals that Trump's détente threat was not simply rhetoric aimed at Moscow, but a destabilizing force rippling through every tier of the international system. The hook lies in the recognition that diplomacy itself has been weaponized. Instead of reducing tensions, the very language of negotiation now functions as an accelerant, amplifying the psychological warfare between great powers and eroding the already fragile scaffolding of international order. The Global South, heavily dependent on Black Sea grain flows, suffered recurring food insecurity as Moscow targeted Ukrainian export infrastructure. Global defense industries surged, embedding militarization as a structural feature of economies, with resources reallocated from civilian priorities to military production. Markets reflected this instability. Currency fluctuations across Europe intensified, energy futures spiked with each Russian strike, and investor sentiment wavered under the recognition that U.S. political volatility now functioned as a market-moving factor. Trump's threat added another destabilizing layer, as the prospect of diplomacy could no longer stabilize investor confidence, but instead deepened uncertainty about the trajectory of the war. Political and diplomatic pressures cascaded across capitals. European leaders, fearing abandonment, accelerated independent planning for prolonged support of Ukraine, even as domestic opposition mounted against rising costs. Germany institutionalized military aid through long-term budgetary commitments, while France pressed harder for European strategic autonomy, wary of dependency on U.S. leadership. Russia amplified narratives of American incoherence, portraying Trump's stance as evidence that the West was fractured and unreliable. China, analyzing with strategic patience, interpreted the conditioning of détente as a warning that Washington's approach to great power rivals would be to weaponize negotiation as coercion. Across the Global South, skepticism toward Western diplomacy hardened, with states increasingly turning toward alternative frameworks presented by BRICS members as shields against Western dominance. The conclusion of this fourth sequence underscores the tightening of the global pressure cooker. Trump's words did not offer Russia an exit. They narrowed the corridor of maneuver until even the possibility of face-saving compromise eroded. Ukraine, fighting for survival, could not accept a framework built on concessions. NATO, pulled between deterrence imperatives and domestic exhaustion, remained structurally fragile. The global economy absorbed new shocks, embedding militarization as a defining condition. Diplomacy itself, transformed into coercive signaling, lost credibility as a mechanism for resolution. The escalation chain thus became self-sustaining. Military attrition drove political volatility fed economic turbulence, and economic turbulence undermined diplomatic credibility. The détente threat, reframed as ultimatum, became less a path to peace than a structural guarantee of prolonged instability. What remains is a geopolitical order in which even the instruments of dialogue serve as weapons, ensuring that the Ukraine war endures not as a discrete conflict, but as a defining condition of international fragility. By reframing détente as conditional punishment, Trump ensured that what once signified a pause in confrontation now became synonymous with escalation deferred but not avoided. The event description situates this shift within Ukraine's hardened battlefield. The war had entered a brutal rhythm of attrition, defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by grinding exchanges along heavily fortified lines. Russia, leveraging its demographic depth and industrial mobilization, sought to exhaust Ukraine's capacity by sheer endurance. Ukrainian forces equipped with Western technology but constrained by manpower and logistics attempted precision disruption, striking deep into Crimea, sabotaging supply depots, and escalating drone warfare across Russian territory. This stalemate hardened into permanence, each side locked into an attritional spiral with no decisive breakthrough in sight. It was against this backdrop of unyielding war that Trump's words reverberated, threatening Putin with the loss of even the illusion of negotiation, signaling that endurance alone would not deliver a political settlement on Russia's terms. Systemic vulnerability widened as global governance frameworks proved incapable of managing the compounding crises. The United Nations, long paralyzed by Security Council vetoes, had been relegated to symbolic debates, unable to broker even humanitarian corridors with consistency. The OSCE, once a cornerstone of European security dialogue, was marginalized by the scale of violence. NATO, despite expansion and reinforcement, remained structurally strained by divergent threat perceptions. Eastern Europe pressed for permanent deployments and maximalist deterrence, while Southern Europe prioritized migration and Mediterranean instability. Inside the United States, partisan divides turned Ukraine into a proxy battleground for domestic politics, making American leadership itself a variable of instability. Trump's threat magnified this vulnerability by broadcasting to allies and adversaries alike that U.S. commitments could shift with electoral cycles, transforming predictability into volatility and volatility into strategy. Military escalation pressed forward with relentless momentum. Russia intensified its bombardment of Ukrainian critical infrastructure, seeking to plunge cities into darkness and test civilian endurance. Ukraine, with increasing support from NATO members, extended its strike range, hitting depots and command nodes deep within Russian territory. Each strike raised the risk of retaliatory escalation, with Moscow reviving nuclear rhetoric as deterrence signaling. Trump's intervention layered political escalation atop military dynamics, suggesting that the absence of Russian compliance would not lead to negotiation, but to intensified American-backed warfare. In effect, Detente ceased to be an escape valve and became another rung on the escalation ladder, ensuring that each failed overture for peace compounded the risks of spiraling conflict. Economic ripples spread with destabilizing breadth. Europe continued to absorb the high costs of decoupling from Russian energy, diverting vast resources toward LNG imports and renewable acceleration, while facing competitiveness erosion in manufacturing. The fifth and closing arc of this analysis begins with the recognition that Trump's détente threat to Putin has now transcended the realm of bilateral confrontation and become a structural signal embedded in the global system. The hook lies in the sobering realization that what was once a language of restraint has mutated into a vocabulary of coercion, stripping diplomacy of its mediating role and rebranding it as an extension of pressure. Economic ripples amplified as the war became a permanent structural condition of the global economy. Energy diversification reduced Europe's direct dependence on Russian hydrocarbons, but costs remained high, eroding competitiveness and deepening industrial anxiety. Food insecurity persisted across the global south, where reliance on Black Sea grain exports collided with Russian blockades and targeted strikes. Defense industries across the U.S. and Europe surged, embedding militarization into national economies, while markets priced instability as a permanent variable. Trump's invocation of détente's threat only heightened volatility. Instead of calming markets, the language of conditional diplomacy deepened uncertainty, ensuring that investor sentiment treated peace prospects not as stabilizers, but as triggers for further unpredictability. Political and diplomatic pressures reverberated across every axis of influence. In Europe, leaders confronted the dual challenge of sustaining aid to Ukraine while navigating domestic backlash against rising economic costs. Eastern Europe pressed for maximalist deterrence, fearing that any wavering would embolden Moscow, while Western Europe sought pathways to reduce exposure to Washington's political oscillations. Russia sought to exploit divisions by framing Trump's words as evidence of American incoherence, positioning itself as resilient against Western pressure. China, analyzing carefully, internalized the lesson that U.S. diplomacy could be wielded as coercion, preparing its own deterrence frameworks in anticipation of similar tactics in the Indo-Pacific. In the Global South, skepticism hardened into disengagement, with states increasingly unwilling to align with Western initiatives perceived as conditional or coercive, instead pivoting toward alternative forums that promised autonomy, even if lacking enforcement. The open-ended conclusion underscores the structural inevitability of fragility. Trump's détente threat to Putin was not an isolated statement, but a crystallization of the broader trend that diplomacy itself has become indistinguishable from coercion, that negotiations no longer serve as mechanisms of resolution, but as instruments of escalation. Ukraine remains locked in a war of attrition that neither side can decisively win nor politically afford to lose. NATO remains powerful yet brittle, hostage to American political volatility. The global economy absorbs militarization and instability as permanent features, while governance institutions prove unable to provide mediating functions. Russia, pressured yet entrenched, cannot retreat without strategic collapse. Ukraine, dependent yet defiant, cannot concede without existential defeat. The result is an international order where every lever, military, economic, diplomatic, functions less as a stabilizer than as a destabilizer. The détente threat, once a vocabulary of easing, now signals only the tightening of the pressure cooker. The conflict does not move toward resolution, but toward permanence, embedding itself as a defining structural condition of the 21st century. This shift is not contained to Ukraine. It reverberates across the architecture of global order, revealing that every front, from military confrontation to economic turbulence to diplomatic engagement, is now entangled in a cycle of escalation where the prospect of resolution is continually deferred. The event description situates this transformation within the hardened stalemate of Ukraine itself. The front lines remain deeply entrenched, with Russia consolidating gains through layered fortifications and Ukraine countering with targeted strikes deep into Crimea and Russia's own border regions. Civilian infrastructure became a permanent target, with Moscow weaponizing winter and Kiev leveraging drone warfare to stretch Russian defenses. What had begun as an invasion in early 2022 calcified into a protracted struggle of attrition by 2025, where neither side could achieve decisive victory, yet neither could afford to retreat. It was within this arena of stalemate that Trump's threat reverberated most clearly, reframing the conflict not as one awaiting negotiated settlement, but as a contest whose only resolution would come through compliance with U.S. dictates or through indefinite escalation. Systemic vulnerability deepened across the transatlantic alliance and beyond. NATO, expanded in membership and fortified in deployments, remained structurally dependent on American leadership, yet American leadership itself was fractured by electoral politics and partisan divisions. Trump's signaling reinforced the perception that U.S. commitments were conditional, reversible, and tied to individual political figures rather than institutional consensus. This fragility reverberated through European capitals, where leaders attempted to insulate themselves from Washington's volatility by pursuing greater autonomy, yet remained tethered to the military and economic gravity of the United States. Beyond the West, the systemic vulnerability manifested in global governance. The United Nations, long paralyzed, offered no mechanisms of de-escalation, while alternative platforms such as BRICS positioned themselves as counterweights but lacked enforcement capacity. The net result was a world order unable to mediate crises, where systemic fragility itself became the defining condition. Military escalation pressed forward in ways both overt and subtle. Russia, supplied through shadow networks with munitions from North Korea and drones from Iran, reinforced its war economy and demonstrated that sanctions alone could not strangle its capacity to wage war. Ukraine, reliant on NATO support, pressed for ever more advanced systems, ensuring that each new delivery raised escalation thresholds. Trump's threat reframed these dynamics, effectively converting diplomacy into an escalation trigger. If Russia resisted, more weapons would flow. If Russia complied, the terms would still be dictated externally. The result was a spiral where military escalation was no longer purely a battlefield calculation, but a direct consequence of political signaling, blurring the line between deterrence and provocation.